members, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our 13th live stream. Today we're going to shift gears and talk about a brand new topic, and that is business insurance considerations in light of the pandemic. We are grateful to have you, and as always, your health and safety is our #1 priority. I want to start today's session with a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all, we want you to be part of the conversation with us. Feel free to ask questions in the chat today. We have professionals standing by ready to get engaged in that dialogue with you. Also, after the session, feel free to submit any additional questions that may arise for you, either using the dialogue box in the link below, or you can visit our website at claconnect.com and go to our COVID-19 resources page. So today we are thrilled to have Hylant join us for an interactive discussion regarding the insurance considerations that we're seeing in our current environment. This will really cover 4 different areas. We're going to start with just in general, what does the environment from an insurance perspective look like right now? Second, how should you read your policy and understand the contract in light of the pandemic? Third, what are some potential cash flow considerations that you might have with respect to insurance? And then finally, if you're contemplating a claim, how do you build an event file? So with that, I'd like to invite our guests to join us. We've got Barbara Gottlieb, and she is from our Valuation and Forensics group here with CLA. We also have 2 individuals I'd like to introduce from Hylant. Please welcome Todd Schreck and Joe Wuligman. So what I'd like to do to kick us all off today is have each of you just give us a quick background so that we all understand what role you're going to play in our discussion. So let's start with you, Barbara.
Sure. Hi. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are in the country today. I am a principal in the forensic services practice of the Century City office, which is in Los Angeles. And my involvement today will be discussing how, assuming there is coverage in your policy, how you would want to go about documenting and building your claim file and how the damage calculations work.
Awesome. Welcome to the discussion. Joe.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, again, depending where you are. Joe Wuligman. I have been in the insurance industry on the commercial property and casualty side for over 28 years in both the brokerage and the carrier side. And currently I oversee our technical risk advisors who work within Hylant on coverage specific areas within the organization.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Todd.
Hello, everybody. I'm Todd Schreck. My title within Hylant is Strategic Growth Leader, which basically means I'm responsible for growth strategies and client retention throughout our footprint. I've been in the business for 30 years, 24 of them in Hylant. And prior to Hylant, I was a client executive for a national broker and began my insurance career on the underwriting side with AIG and Kemper. I'll give you some background in terms of how we helped our clients throughout this event.
That is awesome. Well, we are thrilled to have all of you join us today. And I'd like to start just really at a high level with the Hylant team. You know, I think the discussions that we've had with clients are that really insurance contracts, really like any other contract, need to be thoroughly reviewed from time to time, both by legal counsel and by insurance consultants. And certainly this pandemic, I think, has brought to light the importance of this concept, if you will, of a legal contract. So let's start with the Hylant team and just really discuss at a high level the background on pandemics and any exposure that intersects with the insurance industry. And, you know, you might have some previous experience from the SARS pandemic that occurred, and now certainly what we're seeing with the COVID-19 landscape.
For sure, yeah, and thanks for introducing it that way. You know, policies by nature are a contract between the insured and the insurance company. So it's a legal binding contract, and specific to today's events. If I can take us back 15 years ago, over 15 years ago, years 2002 and 2003, the world was impacted by the outbreak of SARS. And, during that span of a few years, post SARS, insurance companies responded by paying out over $100 million in claims. So there were covered claims at that time. Majority of them were business interruption related. But at that time, the trigger of coverage was much more broad than what we typically see today. So we want to make certain that, the audience understands that there's been some evolution in terms of how policies of yesterday have evolved into policies of today with, frankly, a bit more tighter underwriting and exclusions within the policy terms.
So certainly I think it's been a fluid environment and, we don't know where this will end up, but what are you guys seeing in terms of claims that you're seeing right now? Yeah,
again, let me just connect it to, the 2002-2003 period. Coverage at that time, how coverage was triggered was around the coverage trigger of risks of direct physical loss. And around 2005, 2006, when the Insurance Services Office began to, make some changes to typical standard policy forms, what occurred at that time was the risks of term was taken out of the coverage. So with respects to now what's happening in today's world in terms of how fluid it has become, the outside interest into trying to fight for the economy and looking for, I'll say, venues of helping with the economic recovery, obviously with many influences from the state level, federal level. It's been a political ping pong ball, and there's constant changes happening. Even as of today, we heard that the District of Columbia, they have I think it was from the Chamber of Commerce or some level of interest, mentioned that they wanted to put into a bill that business interruption coverage would be triggered retroactively for a certain level of employee count. And I think it started off at 100 and now has been increased to 250. So we're going to see continued pushes in terms of many different factions looking for ways to for an economic recovery, to help us with that situation.
Sure, that's really interesting. So, as you're hearing those things in the market, certainly you're probably having a lot of conversations with your clients on this topic and what they're hearing and just what claims look like. So how are you guys as a company, Hylant, approaching the claims conversation with clients?
Well, knowing that it's a difficult decision. There's not been one business that hasn't been impacted by COVID-19. So we've taken a position of just walking the mile with them, helping them through this difficult situation. And it's basically we've taken them down two paths. One is a path of reviewing their policies with them so that they can frankly be reacquainted to the coverage that they bound that would be in place today. And so you have those difficult discussions with them because the majority of the policies that are written today, especially on the property and business interruption side, have certain exclusions in them that we discussed earlier, with respects to SARS and the change of policy form. So it's that has caused an issue, of course, as they are looking to recover in some form or fashion. So we walked that mile with them, reviewing their policies with them, and then as well we've taken also a path of helping them understand maybe other ways to help with them recovering from this event.
That's great, and you really talked about the fact that one of the critical things to do here is to review your policy. That is a legal contract. And so maybe we can just shift to thinking about how you read that policy in light of COVID-19. So what are some critical considerations that businesses need to understand in their policy, especially in light of the pandemic?
Well, first, I think you want to look at just ultimately establishing the effective date of the addition of the policy. So various policies have come into play over the years. And if the addition is prior to 2010, there may be more flexibility and more ambiguous wording. Once you get just understanding the addition level, understanding how coverage is actually triggered. And it's very declarative within it. May require for third-party policies like a general liability or an auto policy, bodily injury and or property damage. Within a property policy, physical damage may be the coverage trigger. But understanding what that wording looks to is also something really critical for the rest of the coverage to follow. Then at that point, understanding if you think you've had a loss, the notice provisions. So what are your responsibilities as a policyholder to the carrier with regards to that information? Because you don't want to have a notice provision be a causation for them to have a disagreement with you. And then as you get into kind of the forays, and it's understanding the exclusions. So you have the coverage trigger, it tells you how it's going to be covered, but then there's some exclusions that say except fors. And so understanding what the except fors might be in those situations is really a critical area. And then within the endorsements, there will be additional coverages either provided through the endorsements, which may also have some exclusions in them. So there may be a give back of coverage with a takeaway of coverage. So it's understanding how each of those play out.
So I'm really glad that you brought up exclusions a couple times. I think that's really important. And so how do exclusions work on a policy, and why exclusions, why are they included in an insurance contract?
Well, exclusions are important because many times that's for a risk or a peril that's really uninsurable. If you look at many of the exclusions and how they've come about, war. Clearly, when you start talking about the actual cause of war, that's not something that you can put a price on and understanding the impact. And over time, exclusions have been added to policies as situations have been insured that probably were not the dynamic of which the contract was originally written for. A term that's used in today's world is all risk policy. And there really are no all risk policies. That's a verb or a term that's old and kind of antiquated with regards to insurance, because it supplies you with information that's not really true in saying that there is all risk. So policies are more open peril and all risk type components with those exclusions.
About the different lines of coverage that people might have in terms of general liability, property, they might have business interruption, workers' compensation. What do you need to think about in terms of those contracts and the policy as you're trying to just consider that in light of the pandemic?
I think how you consider those is understanding there's first-party policies, which are typically your property policies, things that apply to you as the policyholder. And then there's third-party, so the damages that you've done to another party, which is typically your general liabilities. Within your first-party policies, the property, workers' compensation, protecting your employees. What's the burden of proof of the employee to prove that they contacted the virus at your location? They may have gotten the virus, but the states each have jurisdictions in which they may have different dynamics that say you have to prove it occurred in the course of your employment, or there may be some protections that are being legislatively delivered right now for protecting first responders, people that were essential employees during this time. The general liability aspect would be then if you caused an injury to a party that came on your property. So for an example, the restaurant industry, as people come onto their properties, or the grocery stores, did they contract the virus there? That person would have to file a claim against the policyholder, against our clients in that arena. So
that's great. Great. So, one thing that people have sent in the chat is that I think as people have reviewed their contracts, some of them have found out that they don't have business interruption insurance coverage for COVID-19. So are there any other options for coverage that they should, think about?
Well, in looking at business interruption coverage per se, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But the impact on their revenue and looking at what other things may have been impacted, you could have various policies, depending on the industry, that may have been specifically written to cover scenarios that caused them losses. Some event policies may have some triggers in there, some business travel accident. There can be some various policies that help recover from a loss, but not particularly business interruption per se.
Sure. So Kevin, as a follow-up to that, actually asked, is COVID-19, which is a healthcare disaster, also some type of a natural disaster? And I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm going to comment to say, I think our government has labeled it in some ways as a natural disaster. I think we have to be very careful because we're not lawyers and this is going to be very litigated across the board. So there are certain things that gets labeled natural disaster, healthcare disaster, that's got a lot of legal framework to walk through before the insurance policy will interpret that. So I have to be very careful in those scenarios.
Totally understand. So, you mentioned various items within the policy, and people may or may not be able to do things retroactively based on how their policy is written. But I think a big topic that a lot of people have had throughout this across many angles of their business, whether it's tax or lending, is just how do they impact cash flow? And I'd be curious, what your team is doing to positively impact cash flow for clients throughout the pandemic and how people can be thinking about that.
Early on in this, when we again mentioned how we consulted with our clients beyond just coverage, which we've discussed here today, but also we looked at that we knew the policies that we had in place for our customers, and we negotiated with the carrier in good faith, that at the beginning of that policy, nobody thought of COVID-19 type of event. So, with that in mind, from an underwriting perspective and how premium is derived, we knew that revenues were projected without a COVID-19 event, right, impacting it. Payroll, headcount, those are the types of underwriting basis that how premium is calculated. So we took basically a proactive approach and went to every carrier and nearly every line of coverage where there was a potential audit feature, that we wanted to make certain that we worked with our carriers on behalf of our customers to frankly realign a COVID type of an event of how it was impacting the company midterm. Don't wait until audit, right? There's no reason to wait. Let's impact cash flow from a positive standpoint and support them in that way. Coverage is going to be, even if there is coverage or not, it's going to be a longer term event as part of helping to get a business back up to where it was. But in terms of premium is something though that could be changed midstream, and we kind of knew that insurance companies were going to be on board with this. So, for example, if you have like workers' compensation, that's underwritten off of payroll. Payroll is going to be lower. Already go and just have that discussion with the carrier, and not renegotiate premium, but reset premium at levels that would be more real, more aligned with what the events of a COVID-19 is going to have on them, out to the policy term. Same with general liability and product liability, which utilizes revenue for the most part. And many of our clients have larger commercial vehicle fleets. So there too, there were many of our customers had their vehicles sitting not being driven over the road. So we also had discussions with carriers on kind of readjusting the premium that auto was based off of. So that's how we were able to, and we continue to do so for our clients, is have impacting them that way from a positive standpoint of, again, realigning premiums to what the exposure is likely going to be. And we also want to make certain, as most policies have minimum and deposits, those typically are static. So we wanted to make certain that, and again, carriers are willing to have that discussion, is get relief that minimum and deposits should not be basically part of the contract, because again, nobody thought COVID-19 type of event was gonna hit us globally.
Sure.
And I was going to add just one part into that too. Within the workers' compensation arena right now is assessing the codes associated with your workers' compensation, because people are performing different work than they may have performed previously.
Oh, good point.
So not having the idea of understanding what work comp codes may be available for telecommuting, but also if people are no longer on the furlough with a furlough payroll, they may be generating that. So there will probably be codes designated for that payroll, which won't have premium associated with it. So to monitor and keep track of that data as well as you're looking forward into that discussion. And I did want to add one question or one statement. The natural disaster component, it's more of been labeled a federal emergency in those arenas. I don't want it to be a natural disaster. So I apologize, I misspoke there. But
no, that's great. I'm glad you clarified that. So I think you guys have given some really nice outlays in terms of understand the environment, understand the legislation that's coming out, understand your current policy, and have a conversation with the insurance company about that. And then lastly, also understand how have my operations morphed, and is there something I can do because of that to impact cash flow really prospectively here. As you think about just, what we've talked about, are there any other last action items you would want people to be considering?
Just to add one point to that, much of the discussion is around business interruption. However, we've consulted our clients to get ready, to get prepared for, with the impact of COVID-19. We're seeing a lot of layoffs. We're seeing furloughed employees. And, in terms of like frequency of claims that seem to be coming in, again, on more business interruption, workers' compensation's right there. We have general liability and product liability claims that, kind of are next in line. But what will be coming very soon and be prepared for is employment-related practices claims, and also directors and officers. There'll be many complaints coming from vendors and the supply chain risks that D&O is likely to be exposed.
Well, we really appreciate your insights just on what the environment looks like and some good action steps. I'd like to now turn to Barbara and really take the conversation to what we talked about at the beginning, was building your event file. And so as we think about all of the things that Highland talked about, Barbara, I would be curious what actions you recommend companies take to create an event file for potential claims.
Sure. And as they previously discussed, while they're trying to figure out if there's a triggering event for a claim and for a loss, you should open your mind to building a claim file or an event file immediately. And then you can go backwards and figure out whether you have a claim, and at least you have everything preserved. Damages, assuming there is a triggering event and coverage, damage calculations can be very nuanced, and they may include expenses that you may not have considered when building your claim, or some type of loss of revenue that resulted as a result of this event. Damages in themselves are meant to compensate the insured for what their operating results would have been had this event not occurred. So people need to consider that the actual damage calculations are going to run from the time that this COVID pandemic arises So you've got losses during the pandemic, and then there's going to be continued sustained losses until the operations are back to a normal state. So you're going to be tracking these expenses from the moment you have noticed that, you know, you've got a pandemic on your hands and the impact on your business, and all the way through what you have until you're back up and running. So ideally, you would want to open up a general ledger account that would separate and track expenses. There's going to be extra expenses that you're incurring as a result of this COVID. I mean, even if you're buying PPE or you're, you know, whatever you're doing to kind of circumvent supply chain disruptions or whatever, you may have extraordinary shipping costs. You may have additional pieces to consider. Start tracking those in a general ledger account, and basically start to kind of put together in your mind how you think you can best document the losses that you're sustaining. So one measure would be to take the, comparing your historical operations to what actually happened. Or more importantly, if you're on a growth trend and you've got projections, budgets, and forecasts, you need to start comparing those items to what actually happened in your business. And the more documentation you have, the better chances of recovery you're going to have. And, so for example, in your budgets and your forecasts, if you've got board of directors minutes approving these budgets and forecasts and historical pieces monitoring these forecasts against actual results prior to the pandemic, all of this kind of helps build a foundation for your case. So obviously there's going to be historical information from your general ledgers and your tax returns and financial statements. But just, kind of put your thinking cap on, and what, if you were the insurer, what would you want to see to document your claim? And of course, there's going to be, just so you know, there's going to be deductibles and maybe some, allowances that the insurance companies are going to make to reduce your claim.
Well, I like your suggestion a lot, because I think good documentation is important for many things we're seeing in the pandemic. Certainly, we want it for PPP lending. I think we want it to have conversations potentially down the road if we're contemplating an exit, just to say, this was an isolated event here. Let's normalize for that. So there's a whole host of reasons, I think, to do that. And certainly this is yet another important reason. I'd be curious, Barbara, as you have been helping with this, what are some of the specific ways that your team at CLA has helped clients to navigate this?
Well, the first thing is to understand how the pandemic, we come in and try and discuss with management how the pandemic is in fact interrupting their business. I mean, again, supply chains are interrupted. Goods and materials are not coming in. They're not able to ship. They can't get deliveries scheduled. And try and help a client go through the very pieces of the nuances that are their claims. Instead of just looking and saying, oh my God, my sales are down, this is my claim, then but there's a lot more to it. So we just kind of go through the business, what the impact has been on a line by line item, and try and help the client understand what the true damages or the losses they're sustaining as a result of this pandemic.
That's great. Any other thoughts you would have as people start to gather information that you'd want the viewers to know?
No, I guess, and we have insurance people on the line, so I'll be careful. Don't be discouraged in terms of looking at your policies. And the insurance carriers have the right to say no, and you have the right to put forth a claim. And that would be my advice, because a lot of the clients are feeling discouraged as a result of people telling them, oh, there's no way you're going to have coverage. But document, and go forward with your loss claim. That's my recommendation. But always have legal counsel involved, because we're the accountants and you always need the lawyers with you.
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the Hylant team. Thank you to our chat moderators for all their great insights. We encourage you to follow up with any questions you might have using the dialog box, or again, you can visit our COVID-19 resource page at claconnect.com. And we look forward to seeing you all again Thursday. But until then, have a wonderful week and be safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.